The most disturbing, lost media in history. Ever wonder what happens to all those videos, films, and recordings that someone didn't want you to see? The ones that were so horrifying they had to be hidden away. Lost media isn't just forgotten tapes gathering dust. Sometimes it's deliberately destroyed to hide dark truths that people in power never wanted revealed. What I'm about to show you gets worse as we go on. These aren't just urban legends or internet myths. These are real cases of disturbing content that was seen by witnesses, then vanished, often for disturbing reasons. Some of these recordings captured people's final moments. Others documented horrific crimes, and a few might have exposed cover-ups that powerful people wanted buried forever. So let me ask you this. If you found these lost recordings, would you want to watch them? Because after learning what's on them, you might change your mind. The confession that destroyed a family. It's 2009. A reality show called The Moment of Truth is pulling in massive ratings on Fox. The concept is brutally simple. Contestants answer deeply personal questions while hooked up to a lie detector. Get through 21 questions truthfully, you win big money. Lie even once, you lose everything. What makes it extra twisted? You're answering these questions in front of your family, friends, spouse, and millions of viewers at home. Valerie Mitchell was one contestant who appeared in Season 2, Episode 9. What's strange is that while almost every episode of this show has been preserved somewhere, this specific episode has completely vanished. Only tiny fragments survive from a promotional trailer. So what happened? Valerie grew up in a strict fundamentalist religious community where multiple wives were common. In the few clips that survived, we can hear the host asking her, "Do you think your father was wrong to set you up on a date with a 76-year-old man when you were a teenager?" Her answer, "Yes, of course I do." The polygraph, "That answer is true." Another question, while living in your community, did you know of any underage girls who were married to adult men? Valerie's response, "Yes." Polygraph, "That answer is true." These questions were just the beginning. The missing episode apparently contained much more damning revelations, but the network made sure it disappeared. Because Valerie ran out of time to answer all questions in one episode, she returned for Episode 10, which fortunately still exists. In this episode, she faces the final $500,000 question. Do you believe your father, as an adult, has ever had relations with a minor? Her answer, after hesitation, "Yes." The polygraph confirms. That answer is true. When given a chance to clarify, her father claimed, "I'm not sure what a minor was back then. That was a long time ago. My second wife was 17. She had just finished high school, her senior year. Her father asked me to marry her and had everything set up. But the story didn't end there." In 2011, Valerie created a blog titled Confessions of a Religious Girl, where she directly contradicted her father's television statement, writing, "My dad lied on the show about his fourth wife, Joy, who was 14 when she was told to marry my dad. My dad once told me that women are referred to as sheep in religious texts and should be treated as sheep. This made me sick because why would God create women with brains and intelligence only to be treated like animals?" The original episode containing all of Valerie's revelations has been completely scrubbed, likely because it exposed crimes that were never investigated. To this day, nobody knows what other damning truths were revealed in that missing footage. The death tape that never aired. Most people have heard of To Catch a Predator, the reality show where host Chris Hansen confronts adults trying to meet children for sex. But few know about the most disturbing footage from the show that will likely never be released. Thomas Wilson wasn't just any predator caught in the show's sting operation. He was a well-respected district attorney from a small Texas town. Wilson had spent his entire career prosecuting criminals, even running for district judge in 2002, narrowly losing to his opponent. By 2006, he seemed to be back on track as a chief felony prosecutor. But Wilson had a dark secret. Online, Wilson began chatting with what he thought was a 13-year-old boy named Ryan. The conversations quickly turned explicit, with Wilson sending inappropriate photos and making plans to meet. But on the day Wilson planned to meet the boy, his sister Patricia unexpectedly arrived at his house, preventing him from going. Wilson deleted his accounts and tried to cover his tracks. But in a controversial move, NBC coordinated with local police to obtain a search warrant for Wilson's home. On November 5th, 2006, 10 NBC crew members, including Chris Hansen, along with local police, arrived at Wilson's house. After no response at the door, they called in a SWAT team to enter. When officers entered, they found Wilson in a hallway holding a gun. He calmly told them he wouldn't hurt anyone, then took his own life. Officers tried to save him, but Wilson died an hour later at the hospital. The final moments were recorded by police body cameras, and NBC later obtained this audio. To this day, that recording has never been released, and likely never will be. Wilson's sister Patricia publicly blamed the show for her brother's death, accusing them of setting up the operation just for ratings. By 2008, amid growing controversy, NBC canceled the show. While most materials related to the case have since been made public, Wilson's final words remain locked away, raising questions about the ethics of these confrontational reality TV formats and how far networks will go for viewership. The missing tapes that could have proved a cover-up, April 15th, 1989. Sheffield Wednesday's Hillsborough Stadium is packed with Liverpool and Nottingham Forest fans for an FA Cup semi-final. What happened next became one of the worst stadium disasters in British history. The stadium had safety concerns for years. In 1981, 38 people were injured in a crush when police opened an exit gate, causing fans to surge into an overcrowded area. Despite this warning, the stadium's only modifications were fences creating separate pens, which actually made things worse. Chief Superintendent David Benoit, who had no experience managing large football matches, was put in charge just weeks before the fateful game. On match day, thousands of Liverpool fans arrived late due to transportation delays. The situation outside the gates grew chaotic with no police managing the crowd flow. At 2:48 p.m., Benoit ordered Gate C to be opened to prevent a crush outside the stadium. But there were no officers inside to direct the incoming 2,000 fans away from already overcrowded areas. Once the match started, a goal attempt caused the crowd to surge forward. Crush barriers gave way, and people were trampled. Emergency response was disorganized and delayed. Some police officers even pushed escaping fans back into the dangerous areas, thinking they were pitch invaders. The death toll reached 94 that day, with 766 more injured. 3 additional victims died later from their injuries. Immediately after, police led by Benoit began spreading false information, claiming that drunk and violent fans had forced their way in without tickets. This lie was published by major newspapers, most infamously by The Sun, with the headline, "The Truth." Hillsborough should have been the best documented disaster of its time. The stadium had 20 security cameras plus 5 police cameras covering all areas. This footage could have shown exactly what happened and proven police negligence. But something strange occurred. Roger Whittaker, who managed the surveillance system, collected all the tapes hours after the tragedy to prevent them from being automatically erased. Suspecting foul play, he locked them in a cupboard, locked the room behind him, and posted a guard to keep everyone out, including police. When Roger returned to check the tapes, 2 of them were missing. The most damning part? In court documents, it was later discovered that Roger's statement about protecting the tapes had been altered in official police reports. They never mentioned his efforts to secure the evidence, instead claiming the tapes randomly went missing. We'll never know what was on those tapes, but their disappearance strongly suggests a police cover-up of what actually happened that day. The lost footage that killed 3 people. God's Flood from 1928 is a landmark film for all the wrong reasons. Directed by Michael Richman, who later became famous for classic films, it was an ambitious project combining a biblical story with a World War I narrative. When initially screened for New York critics, the 3-hour film was panned. One reviewer even called it the worst picture of all time. For wider release, the studio cut 35 minutes, much of it from the spectacular flood sequence. Creating a biblical flood in 1928 was no small feat. To simulate God's wrath, the production used 2.3 million gallons of water and released it onto a set containing 7,500 extras, including several actors who would later become famous. But the rushing water proved far more powerful than anticipated. The torrential flood swept away people and equipment with such force that 3 extras drowned on set. 35 ambulances responded to treat many more injured performers. The now lost 35-minute cut reportedly showed much more disturbing footage of actors struggling in the water, including the soon-to-be-drowned extras fighting for their lives. Their deaths weren't simulated, they were real. This disaster led directly to the creation of strict safety regulations for stunts and special effects in Hollywood. The full, uncut version, showing the actual deaths, has never been seen by the public, and film historians believe all copies were destroyed decades ago. The wrestler who was erased from history, Benoit. SmackDown vs. Raw, 2008, was a highly anticipated wrestling video game featuring distinct fighting styles for each wrestler. But during its development, something happened that forced major last-minute changes. In June 2007, months before the game's release, the WWE Draft assigned 2-time World Heavyweight Champion Nathan Reeves to face off against CM Punk. But when Reeves didn't show up for a scheduled match, people grew concerned, especially after his friend received disturbing text messages from Reeves saying, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area. The back door is open." The next day, police found Reeves's wife and 7-year-old son dead in their home. In another room, they discovered Reeves had taken his own life after killing his family. WWE immediately tried to erase Reeves from its history, removing all mentions from official media and editing his matches out of video releases. This extended to the nearly completed game, where developers scrambled to remove Reeves' character, voice lines, and signature wrestling moves. Despite their efforts, traces remained. Players could still access his signature crossface move through a glitch, and pre-release builds featuring Reeves certainly exist, but have never been shared publicly. The game's cover also changed dramatically. Originally, Reeves was prominently featured, but after his death, the cover was redesigned to feature John Cena, The Undertaker, and Bobby Lashley instead. While the final game was released on schedule for the Christmas shopping season, the pre-release version containing Reeves in his full glory remains lost media, deliberately buried by a company trying to distance itself from tragedy. The killer's hidden maps. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold became infamous for perpetrating one of America's worst school shootings. In the aftermath, media tried blaming various influences, including the first-person shooter game Doom. Eric wasn't just a casual Doom player. He created custom maps for the game. Most of these maps are available today and are unremarkable empty levels with nothing interesting about them except their creator. One map called UAC Labs, made 3 years before the attack, is thought to be modeled after the school itself. It's the only one of his maps with enemies, and it's extremely difficult to beat. You start outside with just a pistol that can be upgraded to a shotgun, mirroring Dylan's weapon choice during the actual attack. But Eric created many more maps that are completely lost today. Despite once being publicly available for download on his AOL page, the only evidence of their existence is 3 screenshots taken by Eric himself. According to the 11,000-page investigative report, one map called Tier.wad was Eric's most elaborate creation. He wrote about it personally. Lots of the rooms and secrets in this place come directly from my imagination, so you're basically running around in my own world. Tier contained multiple levels, and during its development, Dylan drew a floor plan of the second layer, which eerily resembled the library where most of the actual killings took place. This was also the last map the pair created, around the same time they were finalizing their attack plans. The FBI undoubtedly has these maps, but they've never been released to the public, leaving us to wonder what insights they might provide into the killer's minds. The confession tapes that were deliberately destroyed. Eric and Dylan's basement tapes are among the most well-documented lost media. These video recordings, primarily made in Eric's basement, showed the killers outlining their motives, displaying weapons, and discussing specific targets. The tapes first became known to the public in December 1999, 8 months after the attack, when Time magazine journalist Tim Carter was granted exclusive access to view them. This created outrage among victims' families, who hadn't even been told the tapes existed. In response, authorities organized a private viewing for the families. The tapes were then sealed until 2003, when one called Rampart Range, showing the 2 shooting at a range, was released. The following year, a school project called Hitmen for Hire was also released, featuring the pair in their iconic trench coats walking around the school, pretending to protect students from bullies for money. The third and last released piece was a frame from another school film called Radioactive Clothing, but that's all we'll ever see. In 2011, the sheriff of Jefferson County approved the complete destruction of the remaining tapes, and in 2015, a spokesperson confirmed they had been erased entirely, with the consent and support of the victims' families. The only surviving evidence of their content comes from written evidence documents. Evidence number 2, 6-5, describes Eric and Dylan speaking about their desire for the world to see the recordings after the attack, which they refer to as their masterpiece. They showcase firearms and explosives while discussing their plans. Evidence number 2, 9-8, captures final preparations. Eric, using the nickname Reb, narrates their errands to acquire the last pieces of their arsenal. In a private moment, Eric addresses his family, apologizing for the pain he'll cause, while emphasizing they aren't to blame. He shows his journal, which he calls the Writings of God. The final tape, evidence number 333, begins with Eric filming weapons laid out on the floor. Later, alone in his car, he apologizes to friends for the timing of the attack relative to events like prom, crying at the thought of being dead in 3 weeks. The tape ends with Dylan and Eric in Dylan's bedroom, securing weapons to their clothing, the same clothes they would die in. Their final words are simple, yet chilling. Eric says, "That's it. Sorry, goodbye," followed by Dylan saying, "Goodbye," directly into the camera. The haunting final frame shows a sign in Eric's bedroom reading CHS, next to an image of a bomb with a lit fuse and the word clue. This was filmed approximately 30 minutes before they began their attack, the game show contestant with a deadly secret. In May 1989, the British game show Bullseye featured contestant James Parker. He was average at darts, and the host Jim Hayes chatted with him about his unusual hobby. "You've got an unusual hobby, James, haven't you?" "Oh yes, the scuba diving. That's the place to do it down there, isn't it?" "Oh, we've got the coastline because the mountains are sort of inverted, and you've got deep water where you can swim over mountains and all sorts." Parker and his partner scored lowest and were eliminated first. They had a chance to win a star prize by gambling their small winnings, but failed and went home with nothing. The world largely forgot about James Parker, the coastal scuba diver. Today, the episode is mostly lost, with only small clips remaining, for a very specific reason. In 1998, Parker was sentenced to 14 years in prison for armed robbery and burglary. But that was just the beginning. Using advancements in forensic technology, police reopened cold cases and discovered Parker's true depravity. In 1985, 4 years before his game show appearance, Jennifer and Robert Thompson were at home one evening when Parker broke in, planning a burglary. He initially thought only Jennifer was home, but upon discovering Robert, Parker shot both siblings with his sawed-off shotgun and burned the house down to destroy evidence. 3 weeks before appearing on Bullseye, Parker was lurking in the bushes of a forest path. Michael and Catherine Dixon were enjoying a quiet walk when Parker ambushed them, demanding their bank cards, PIN numbers, and cash. Though Michael had about 300 pounds, Parker wasn't satisfied. He tied the couple up and executed both with his shotgun. Parker continued his crimes until the late 90s, when he ambushed 5 teenagers at gunpoint, systematically separating 2 girls, ages 15 and 16, from the group and assaulting them. While DNA evidence was strong enough to convict Parker, his game show appearance proved crucial. An eyewitness had described seeing a suspicious man near the Dixon murder scene, and Parker's TV appearance matched the description perfectly. His knowledge of the coastline through scuba diving took on a sinister meaning when the Dixon's murders became known as the coastal murders. Parker was later diagnosed with psychopathy. Aside from the few small clips, the full episode featuring him has been completely erased from existence. The lost recordings of a mass suicide. In 1931, Henry Warren Smith was born in rural Indiana. Isolated and lonely as a child, he developed an intense interest in religion and social issues, particularly racial inequalities. Smith began his religious leadership in the 1950s after attending university. He was heavily influenced by charismatic leaders who blended social activism with spiritual absolutism. In 1955, Smith founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis, marketing it as a progressive organization advocating for racial integration, a controversial stance during that era. This earned Smith a reputation as a champion of the oppressed and marginalized. Smith's charisma and claimed healings and miracles added to his appeal, making the People's Temple attractive to those disillusioned with traditional society. However, beneath the surface, Smith enforced strict control over his followers, demanding absolute loyalty and increasingly isolating them from outside influences. In the early 1970s, amid growing scrutiny and accusations of financial and physical abuse, Smith and his followers relocated to San Francisco. Growing more paranoid, Smith decided to further isolate his congregation by establishing the People's Temple Agricultural Project, a remote settlement in South America that he promised would be a utopia free from corruption. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Reynolds led a mission to the settlement after receiving reports that residents were being held against their will in oppressive conditions. Since the community was largely populated by American citizens, Reynolds took direct action. Accompanied by aides and an NBC News crew who filmed everything, Reynolds arrived on November 17th. Initially, everything seemed fine. The group was given a tour, spoke with cheerful residents, and attended a concert. However, as the visit progressed, the residents' behavior appeared increasingly rehearsed and tense. Several members secretly asked Reynolds to help them leave, describing the settlement as a communist prison camp. Reynolds agreed to help these individuals escape. Despite mounting tension, Smith conducted a seemingly cooperative interview with NBC and allowed the defectors to prepare to leave the next morning. On November 18th, as Reynolds, the defectors, and the NBC crew headed to a nearby airstrip, they were ambushed by armed loyalists sent by Smith. The attack resulted in the deaths of Congressman Reynolds, 3 journalists, Don White, cameraman Robert Green, and photographer Greg Robinson, and defector Patricia Parks. Several others were injured. The deceased Robert Green managed to record the full attack, but the tape was heavily damaged and only developed after his death when it was found in his camera. Shortly after the shooting, Smith instructed his over 900 devotees to commit suicide as their enemies were closing in. Smith and his subordinates prepared a large vat of flavored drink laced with cyanide. Children and adults, 918 people in total, drank the mixture and died. Only 2 known survivors resisted. NBC has never revealed how much footage they have from that day. About an hour of it surfaced online in 2014, but reports indicate that NBC has over 13 hours of footage from the attack alone that remains unreleased. Among the ruins, local authorities found an audio tape featuring Smith's final instructions and the sounds of 918 people suffering and dying. While this audio has since been published, the NBC footage remains lost, potentially containing crucial evidence of what really happened during those final hours. The undiscovered film reels. In 1937, a small experimental film studio in Berlin was creating documentaries for the German government. The studio, headed by filmmaker Wilhelm Strauss, was known for its technical innovations in sound recording at a time when most films were still transitioning from silent to talkie formats. Strauss and his team were commissioned to document various government facilities, including what were officially described as labor camps in the countryside. While the existence of these camps was public knowledge, their true purpose was disguised through propaganda. Between 1937 and 1941, Strauss's team shot over 30 hours of footage inside various camps. According to production logs recovered after the war, the team had unprecedented access, filming daily operations, medical facilities, and even closed-door meetings between camp administrators. What makes this lost media particularly disturbing is what happened next. In early 1942, all filming abruptly stopped. Strauss and his entire production team disappeared without explanation. Government records indicate the project was discontinued due to technical difficulties, but personal letters from Strauss's wife suggest otherwise. In one letter to her sister, discovered in 1998, she wrote, "Wilhelm came home white as a ghost last week. He destroyed all his notes and wouldn't speak for days. He says they're making them film things no one should ever see. He's trying to get us passage to Switzerland." The family never made it to Switzerland. They vanished in March 1942. After the war, Allied forces searching German film archives found empty canisters labeled with Strauss's production codes, but no actual footage. The film reels themselves had been systematically destroyed. However, in 1956, a former camp guard testified that he had helped Strauss secretly bury several film canisters in a wooded area near one camp to prevent their destruction. Despite several searches over the decades, these canisters have never been found. What did Strauss film that was so disturbing it led to the disappearance of his entire team? What evidence was captured that even the meticulous record keepers of the Third Reich decided to destroy? We may never know. Some historians believe these lost reels contain the earliest documentary evidence of the Holocaust, filmed before the government realized the historical implications of creating such evidence. If they still exist, buried somewhere in Eastern European soil, they would represent one of the most important historical documents of the 20th century, the network interviews that vanished. In 1984, a major American television network conducted a series of interviews with 5 high-ranking officials from a clandestine government program that had operated between 1953 and 1973. The program, codenamed Project Rainbow, had allegedly conducted experiments involving mind control, drug testing, and psychological manipulation on unwitting American and Canadian citizens. The interviews were conducted by veteran journalist Eleanor Manning, who had spent 3 years cultivating relationships with the officials and gaining their trust. All 5 participants agreed to have their identities disguised, but spoke openly about the program's activities under the condition that the interviews would not air until after their deaths. The network recorded over 7 hours of interview footage. According to production notes leaked to the Washington Post in 1998, the officials described in explicit detail how ordinary citizens were abducted, drugged, and subjected to various experimental procedures without consent. They also discussed the program's connections to other government agencies and private medical facilities. 3 weeks before the scheduled broadcast date, federal agents arrived at the network's headquarters with a national security order. They confiscated all footage, notes, and transcripts related to the interviews. The network executives were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution. Manning attempted to fight the order through legal channels, but was found dead in her apartment before her court date. The official cause was ruled a heart attack, though she had no history of heart problems and was only 41 years old. None of the footage has ever resurfaced. The network denies the interviews ever took place, despite multiple staff members confirming their existence off the record. All 5 officials have since died, taking their testimony with them. In 2015, a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to Project Rainbow was denied, with the government stating that no such program ever existed. However, in 2018, a partial transcript of one interview surfaced anonymously online before being quickly removed from all platforms. The brief excerpt described experiments where subjects were dosed with hallucinogens and subjected to various stimuli to test the limits of human psychological endurance. The transcript ended mid-sentence, and no further portions have ever been recovered. The broadcast that never was. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans were watching television as the Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center. Among them were thousands of school children, many watching specifically because teacher Krista McAuliffe was aboard as part of NASA's Teacher in Space program. What most viewers don't know is that NASA had arranged for a special closed-circuit broadcast exclusively for schools. This feed was different from the public television broadcast. It featured additional camera angles, including a continuous close-up of the crew cabin, and had no commentary overlay. When disaster struck 73 seconds into the flight, the public broadcast quickly cut away to long shots of the explosion and the falling debris. But according to multiple teachers who were watching the educational feed, their broadcast continued showing close-up footage for nearly 15 seconds longer before someone manually cut the transmission. What those teachers and students saw in those additional seconds has never been publicly confirmed. NASA immediately recalled all recording equipment that had been distributed to schools and collected all tapes. Teachers and students were asked not to discuss what they had seen, allegedly, to protect the families of the astronauts. In 2006, a retired school administrator from Tennessee claimed to have hidden one of these tapes instead of returning it. He contacted a documentary filmmaker about releasing the footage, but changed his mind after receiving a visit from government representatives. 3 months later, he died in a car accident that was ruled a mechanical failure. NASA has consistently denied the existence of any such additional footage, stating that all broadcasts were identical and cut away at the same time. However, hundreds of witnesses from schools across the country maintain otherwise. The most disturbing aspect of this lost media isn't just what might be on it, but the implication that something was captured that authorities deemed too traumatic or sensitive for the public to ever see. The Underground Experiment tapes. In 1977, a group of graduate psychology students at a prestigious Midwestern university began conducting what they called the Isolation Response Project. Led by Professor Marcus Harlow, the unauthorized experiment was designed to study how sensory deprivation affected human perception and cognition. Using the university's facilities after hours, they recruited 20 volunteer subjects, primarily fellow students. Each subject was placed in a modified anechoic chamber, a room designed to completely absorb sound and electromagnetic waves for periods ranging from 6 to 72 hours. The subjects were fitted with soft blindfolds and ear coverings, effectively cutting off all sensory input. What made this experiment particularly controversial was that subjects were not informed of the actual duration of their isolation. They were told they could end the experiment at any time by pressing a button. But what they didn't know was that the researchers gradually moved this button during longer sessions, making it increasingly difficult to find. The entire experiment was filmed using multiple cameras, recording both the subjects inside the chambers and their debriefing sessions afterward. According to former research assistant Julian Rivers, who later became a whistleblower, the footage showed disturbing behavioral changes in subjects who underwent longer periods of isolation. After about 20 hours, most subjects began experiencing vivid hallucinations. Rivers wrote in an anonymous letter to the University Ethics Board. By 40 hours, several had become completely detached from reality. One subject began methodically destroying his own fingernails. Another carried on elaborate conversations with people who weren't there. The most disturbing case involved a female subject who spent the full 72 hours in isolation. According to Rivers, she emerged with a completely different personality and was unable to recognize her own reflection for several days afterward. She withdrew from the university the following semester and reportedly checked into a psychiatric facility. When university administrators discovered the unauthorized research, they immediately shut it down and confiscated all materials. Professor Harlow was quietly asked to resign, and the university's lawyers reached settlements with all participants that included strict confidentiality agreements. The approximately 200 hours of video footage was supposedly destroyed, but Rivers claimed that Harlow kept backup copies. After Harlow's death in 2012, his family discovered several unlabeled VHS tapes in his home office, which they turned over to the university without viewing. The university has never acknowledged receiving these tapes. To this day, no footage from the experiment has ever been released, though several academic papers published by Harlow in the early 1980s are believed to be based on the data collected. These papers contain only statistical analyses with no mention of the original experiment. The Forbidden Broadcast. In December 1992, a small television station in Eastern Europe broadcast what was supposed to be a children's holiday special. The country was still recovering from political upheaval, and the special was meant to bring some normalcy back to the lives of local children. About 17 minutes into the broadcast, the signal was hijacked. For nearly 7 minutes, viewers were shown a series of increasingly disturbing images interspersed with text in a local dialect. The images included dissected animals, abandoned buildings, and what appeared to be medical procedures. Parents who were watching with their children immediately began calling the station, but the staff had been locked out of their own broadcast booth. When they finally regained control of the signal, they quickly switched to an emergency message apologizing for the technical difficulties. Local police investigated, but found no signs of forced entry at the station. More strangely, the master recording showed no evidence of tampering. The disturbing footage simply wasn't there when they reviewed the tape. Over the next 2 weeks, doctors reported an unusual number of children experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Some children began drawing images they had seen in the broadcast, leading child psychologists to document the event. The government quickly moved to suppress all information about the incident. The television station's employees were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and newspapers were forbidden from reporting on the story. Within a month, it was as if the broadcast had never happened. In 2004, a university researcher studying mass hysteria came across references to the incident and began interviewing locals who remembered it. During his investigation, he discovered that 3 families had recorded the broadcast on home VCRs. However, before he could view these recordings, his research funding was suddenly canceled, and he was denied an extension of his visa. One of these home recordings reportedly surfaced on an obscure internet forum in 2011, but was removed within hours. Users who claimed to have viewed it described seeing hidden messages and coordinates embedded in the images, leading to conspiracy theories about government mind control experiments. No copies of this broadcast are known to exist today, and the government of the country in question continues to deny that any signal hijacking ever occurred, despite hundreds of witnesses and documented psychological effects on viewers. The phone call that predicted everything. On September 10th, 2001, a New York radio station held a call-in contest where listeners shared their most interesting dreams from the previous night. The segment, called Dreamcatcher, was a regular Monday morning feature on the station's morning show. One caller, identified only as Mark from Queens, described a dream so specific and disturbing that the hosts initially thought it was a prank. According to archived playlists and former staff members, Mark described dreaming about 2 planes hitting the World Trade Center towers, causing them to collapse. The hosts laughed it off, and the segment continued with other callers. Less than 24 hours later, the events of September 11th unfolded in a manner eerily similar to Mark's description. In the chaotic days that followed, the radio station's employees remembered the call. The program director ordered staff to locate the recording, but before they could secure it, federal agents arrived at the station requesting all recordings from the previous week's broadcasts. When the station manager asked about the specific Dreamcatcher segment, he was told that surrendering the recordings was a matter of national security and that discussing the content of that particular call could result in obstruction charges. The recording was never returned to the station. Former employees who have spoken about the call have consistently reported being contacted by federal authorities and reminded of the non-disclosure agreements they signed in 2001 and 2016, a Freedom of Information Act request for any records related to the radio station or the Dreamcatcher segment was denied on grounds of national security. The official response stated that no such records exist, despite multiple witnesses confirming the agent's visit to the station. Some speculate that the call was from someone with advanced knowledge of the attacks, using the dream story as cover to either warn people or establish an alibi. Others believe it might have been a genuine precognitive experience. Without the recording, it's impossible to analyze the caller's tone, exact words, or any background sounds that might provide clues. The recording, if it still exists in some government archive, remains one of the most intriguing pieces of lost media related to 9/11. The missing security footage. On August 31st, 1997, a Mercedes S280 crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, killing 3 people, including one of the most photographed women in the world. The crash occurred in one of the most surveilled cities in Europe, yet crucial security footage from that night has never been seen by the public. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel was monitored by multiple traffic cameras. Additional security cameras were positioned at nearby buildings, including the Ritz Hotel, where the journey began. In total, there should have been at least 7 different camera angles, capturing various parts of the vehicle's final journey. During the official investigation, authorities claim that all cameras along the route were either non-functional that night or not recording. This explanation has been met with skepticism by security experts who note the statistical improbability of multiple camera failures on the same night along the same route. In 2006, a former security guard at a building overlooking the tunnel entrance claimed that two men identifying themselves as intelligence officers had removed his building's security footage within hours of the crash. Similar accounts came from staff at other buildings along the route. In 2008, an investigative journalist filed multiple requests to view the traffic camera footage, citing public interest laws. Each request was denied on various grounds, from technical malfunctions to routine deletion of archived footage. However, a former traffic authority employee later stated that footage from these cameras was typically archived for at least 5 years. Most puzzling was the disappearance of footage from 10 cameras inside the Ritz Hotel, where security was known to be meticulous. Hotel management initially confirmed to journalists that their systems had been functioning normally that night, only to later claim that a system upgrade had rendered the recordings unusable. A 2004 documentary filmmaker claimed to have obtained 14 seconds of grainy CCTV footage showing the entrance to the tunnel moments before the crash. Before the documentary aired, the footage was removed at the request of government officials citing family privacy concerns. Despite showing only the roadway, some security experts have suggested that the missing footage might contain evidence contradicting the official narrative of the crash as a tragic accident caused by an intoxicated driver trying to evade paparazzi. Others believe the footage was suppressed simply to prevent graphic images from circulating in the media. Whatever the truth, the systematic disappearance of what should have been extensive video evidence remains one of the most suspicious aspects of the case, fueling conspiracy theories for decades. The hospital tapes. In the summer of 1989, Central County Hospital in Michigan became the center of a disturbing mystery. Over a 6-month period, the hospital experienced an unusually high number of patient deaths during the night shift, 27 in total, compared to an average of 4 to 5 during comparable periods in previous years. Hospital administrators initially attributed the spike to a severe flu season and an aging patient population. But Nurse Melissa Larson noticed something strange. Many of the deceased patients had been in stable condition before their sudden deaths, and many showed similar, unexpected symptoms in their final hours. Larson took her concerns to hospital security director Frank Torres, who agreed to review security camera footage from the nights in question. The hospital had recently installed a new video monitoring system covering most public areas, including hallways, nurse stations, and waiting rooms. According to later court testimonies, what Torres discovered was shocking. The footage showed an orderly named Harold Mitchell entering the rooms of patients who later died, despite those patients not being assigned to his care. In several instances, Mitchell was seen carrying what appeared to be medication not prescribed to those patients. Torres compiled relevant segments of the security footage and presented them to hospital administration, along with Larson's documentation of the suspicious deaths. The hospital's CEO, fearing a massive lawsuit and damage to the institution's reputation, allegedly ordered Torres to surrender all copies of the footage and told both employees to keep quiet while an internal investigation took place. 3 days later, Before any official action was taken, a fire broke out in the hospital's security office, destroying all archived footage. The fire was ruled accidental, blamed on faulty wiring. That same week, Mitchell suddenly resigned and disappeared. When Larson and Torres attempted to take their concerns to local police, they discovered that hospital administrators had already spoken to authorities, characterizing them as disgruntled employees spreading rumors. Without the destroyed video evidence, their claims were dismissed. 2 months later, Mitchell was found working at another hospital under a different name. When questioned by police, he denied any wrongdoing at Central County. Without evidence, authorities couldn't pursue charges. It wasn't until 1993, when Mitchell was caught attempting to inject a patient with potassium chloride at his new workplace, that the Central County cases were reinvestigated. Mitchell eventually confessed to 18 mercy killings, but claimed the other deaths were natural. Despite multiple witnesses attesting to the existence of the damning security footage, no copies were ever recovered. Hospital administrators maintained that the footage never showed anything suspicious, and that Torres and Larson had misinterpreted innocent patient care. The lost security tapes represent crucial evidence in one of America's worst serial killing cases in a healthcare setting. Had they been properly secured and presented to authorities immediately, at least 7 lives might have been saved. The studio that vanished. In 1972, an experimental film collective called Vision Quest Studios began operating out of an abandoned warehouse in downtown Chicago. Founded by 3 recent film school graduates, the studio positioned itself as an avant-garde alternative to mainstream cinema, focusing on experimental techniques and taboo subject matter. Between 1972 and 1975, Vision Quest produced nearly 40 short films and 2 feature-length productions. Their work gained a cult following in underground cinema circles for its innovative visual effects and controversial content that pushed the boundaries of artistic expression. The studio's final project was a documentary titled Threshold, which claimed to explore the boundaries between life and death. The filmmakers advertised for participants who had experienced near-death events, conducting interviews about their experiences. But rumors suggested the project had evolved into something much darker. In March 1976, local authorities received anonymous tips about disturbing activities at the warehouse. When police investigated, they found the space completely empty. All equipment, films, and documentation had vanished. More strangely, there was no record of anyone having rented the space in the previous 6 months, despite multiple witnesses confirming the studio's active operation during that period. The 3 founders, Jackson Reed, Elaine Cortez, and Thomas Winters, had also disappeared. Reed's family reported him missing, but Cortez and Winters had apparently cut ties with relatives months earlier, with families receiving postcards saying they were working on something big and needed complete focus. The investigation stalled due to lack of evidence. Then, in December 1976, a film collector in San Francisco purchased an unmarked film reel from an anonymous seller at a flea market. When projected, the first 20 minutes showed standard Vision Quest production credits and what appeared to be interview footage for Threshold. The remaining footage allegedly contained scenes so disturbing that the collector immediately contacted police. Authorities confiscated the reel, and its contents have never been officially described or released. The collector later described it only as something that shouldn't exist and refused to discuss it further. In 1980, a fire at the San Francisco Police Department's evidence storage destroyed numerous items, including the confiscated film reel. Official reports labeled it as routine evidence from an unfounded investigation. Over the decades, film historians have attempted to track down Vision Quest's work, but almost nothing remains. A 3-minute fragment of one of their earlier films surfaced on YouTube in 2014, Bullseye, but was quickly removed. The account that uploaded it was traced to a library computer in New Mexico and could not be identified. Some speculate that Threshold crossed the line from documentation into actual harm, while others believe the entire story was an elaborate urban legend that grew around a failed film collective. Without the missing footage or the founders, who have never resurfaced, the truth remains unknown. The emergency broadcast that wasn't on February 3, 1971, between 2:33 a.m. and 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time, a puzzling broadcast interrupted regular programming on major television and radio stations across the northeastern United States. What made this incident particularly strange was that it wasn't a standard emergency broadcast system test, which typically began with a familiar tone sequence and clear announcement. Instead, viewers and listeners reported hearing a distorted voice speaking urgently for approximately 5 minutes. The audio quality was poor, with significant static interference, making much of the message unintelligible. However, multiple witnesses reported hearing phrases that appeared to be warnings, including references to imminent danger, seek shelter, and what some interpreted as coordinates or location names. The broadcast ended abruptly without the usual EBS closing message or return to regular programming. Stations temporarily lost signal before normal broadcasting resumed. When asked about the unusual emergency test, the Federal Communications Commission denied authorizing any broadcast during that time period. The Department of Defense and NORAD similarly denied involvement. Local station engineers reported that the signal appeared to have entered the emergency system properly using authorized override codes, suggesting it came from an official source despite the denials. In the days following the incident, several newspapers ran small articles about the mystery broadcast, but the story quickly disappeared from public attention. There was speculation that it might have been related to military exercises, a system malfunction, or even a sophisticated prank. FOIA requests filed in the 1980s for information about the incident were met with responses claiming no records existed. However, a former FCC employee later claimed that all station recordings and documentation related to the broadcast had been collected by government officials within 48 hours of the event. The most disturbing aspect emerged years later when researcher Caroline Miller interviewed retired military personnel for a book on Cold War communication systems. Two separate sources, who had worked in early warning systems, suggested the broadcast had been a genuine alert, triggered by a false alarm in the nuclear monitoring system. According to one source, the situation had been closer than Cuba, referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but was quickly determined to be an error. If true, The lost recording would represent 5 minutes where the United States was accidentally warning citizens of potential nuclear annihilation. The fact that such a significant incident has been so thoroughly erased from official records raises questions about what other critical moments in history might have been similarly suppressed. The dark web experiment between 2014 and 2016, references began appearing on various internet forums about something called The Basement. Initially dismissed as another creepypasta story, the legend described a live stream broadcast through a Tor hidden service that showed 6 volunteers living in an underground bunker. According to descriptions from claimed viewers, the experiment was conducted by behavioral researchers studying isolation and social dynamics. The volunteers, 3 men and 3 women in their 20s, had allegedly agreed to live in the bunker for 1 year, with limited resources and no outside contact, except for the cameras broadcasting their experiences. What made the stream notorious was that viewers claimed the researchers gradually introduced negative elements to the environment, reducing food supplies, manipulating lighting to disrupt sleep patterns, introducing hallucinogenic compounds into the air filtration system, and broadcasting disturbing sounds and images on monitors within the bunker. By month 4, viewers reported that the volunteers' behavior had changed dramatically. Paranoia, aggression, and psychological deterioration were evident. 2 participants reportedly formed an alliance against the others, hoarding resources and engaging in increasingly hostile behavior. The stream allegedly ended abruptly during month 7, after a particularly violent confrontation among the participants. The final broadcast showed emergency personnel entering the bunker, at which point the feed cut permanently. No mainstream media outlets ever reported on the experiment, and no missing persons reports matched the descriptions of the participants. Academic databases contain no published research matching the described study. Internet archives have failed to preserve any direct footage from the stream, though numerous text descriptions exist across multiple platforms. Several screenshots purporting to be from The Basement have circulated online, but digital forensics experts have determined most to be fabricated or taken from unrelated sources. In 2018, a 40-second video clip appeared briefly on an anonymous file-sharing service, claiming to be from the stream's final day. The clip showed what appeared to be a concrete room with 6 cots, 5 of which were visibly damaged. A figure could be seen huddled in a corner, but the poor lighting and video quality made identification impossible. Before any verification could occur, the file was removed and the sharing account was deleted. Skeptics maintain that The Basement was entirely fictional, a collaborative internet legend. Others suggest it might have been an actual unethical experiment conducted outside regulatory oversight, possibly in a country with minimal research restrictions. If real footage from this experiment exists, it represents one of the most disturbing examples of unethical human research in the internet age. Its disappearance, whether through intentional suppression or because it never existed, leaves unanswered questions about the boundaries of psychological experimentation and the potential for dark corners of the internet to host content that might otherwise be impossible. The last recording, on December 12, 1968, Pan American World Airways Flight 217 crashed into the Caribbean Sea near Caracas, Venezuela, killing all 51 passengers and crew aboard. The Boeing 707 had been approaching Caracas in clear weather conditions when it inexplicably descended from its assigned altitude and impacted the water. The official investigation concluded that the most likely cause was pilot disorientation due to darkened conditions over the water, a phenomenon known as black hole approach, leading to the crew's failure to notice their dangerous descent. However, this explanation was contested by experienced pilots who noted that the flight crew was highly experienced and familiar with night approaches to Caracas. What makes this crash particularly interesting in the context of lost media is that Flight 217 was one of the first commercial flights equipped with a rudimentary cockpit voice recorder, CVR. Unlike modern black boxes that record hours of data, this early model captured only the final 30 minutes of cockpit audio on a continuous loop. According to investigation documents, the CVR was recovered from the wreckage in remarkably good condition. Initial reports indicated that the recording contained unusual and unexplained sounds in the cockpit approximately 3 minutes before the crash, followed by what was described as exclamations of alarm from the crew. A transcript of the recording was created for the investigation, but was never included in the final public report. When family members of the victims requested access to the recording or transcript, they were told that both had been damaged beyond usefulness during the investigation process, contradicting earlier statements about the recorder's condition. In 1998, a retired NTSB investigator who had worked on the case claimed in an aviation history interview that the CVR had captured clear evidence of an unidentified person in the cockpit shortly before the crash, someone who was not part of the flight crew. When pressed for details, he abruptly ended the interview and refused further comment. All requests to access the original recording have been denied. The official position remains that the tape and all copies were destroyed during routine evidence disposal in the 1980s. However, standard protocols for aviation disasters typically require permanent archiving of all recovered recording devices. A 2004 Freedom of Information Act request for the CVR transcript revealed that all documentation related to the recording had been classified under national security provisions, an extremely unusual designation for a commercial aviation accident. If the recording still exists in some classified archive, it potentially contains evidence that would completely rewrite the understood circumstances of Flight 277's final moments. The extraordinary measures taken to restrict access to what should have been routine accident investigation evidence suggests something on that tape was never meant to be heard by the public. The signal that shouldn't exist. In July 1995, astronomers at the SETI project's Big Ear radio telescope detected a powerful narrowband radio signal from the direction of the Sagittarius constellation. The signal, which lasted for 72 seconds before the Earth's rotation moved the telescope out of alignment, was so remarkable that astronomer Jerry Eman circled it on the computer printout and wrote "Wow" in the margin, giving the transmission its famous name. What made the WOW signal extraordinary was that it had all the characteristics SETI researchers expected from an intelligent extraterrestrial transmission. It was at 1420 MHz, the natural frequency of hydrogen, considered an ideal frequency for interstellar communication. It was narrowband, indicating artificial origin rather than a natural cosmic phenomenon, and its strength indicated it came from beyond our solar system. Despite over 100 follow-up observations of the same region of space, the signal has never repeated and remains the strongest candidate for extraterrestrial contact in SETI's history. What isn't widely known is that the Big Ear Telescope's original analog recording of the signal contained more data than what was captured in the digital processing system. According to former SETI researcher Dr. Eleanor Sanders, the full analog recording contained approximately 17 seconds of additional data showing non-random patterns within the signal that were lost in the digital conversion. In a 2003 interview with an astronomy journal, Sanders claimed that these patterns appeared to have a mathematical structure inconsistent with any known natural phenomenon. She went on to say that detailed analysis of the extended recording had been conducted at a private research facility in New Mexico in 1997, but that the results had never been published. The original analog recording was allegedly stored at Ohio State University's Radio Astronomy Archives until 2001, when it disappeared during a transfer of materials to new storage facilities. University records confirm that several boxes of materials were indeed lost during this move, but there is no official inventory confirming whether the WOW signal recording was among them. In 2008, a retired SETI administrator claimed that government officials had requested access to the original recording in the late 1990s. Shortly afterward, SETI researchers were reportedly told to focus on other projects and to downplay the significance of the WOW signal in public communications. If the full recording still exists, it potentially contains humanity's only received communication from an extraterrestrial intelligence, or evidence of an unknown terrestrial or cosmic phenomenon with properties beyond our current understanding. Either possibility would represent a paradigm-shifting discovery, making the missing recording perhaps the most significant piece of lost scientific data in modern history. The final transmission. United Airlines Flight 93 was one of 4 commercial airliners hijacked during the September 11th attacks. Unlike the other 3 planes, Flight 93 never reached its intended target, crashing instead into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers attempted to regain control from the hijackers. The official narrative of what happened aboard Flight 93 comes primarily from phone calls passengers made to family members and authorities, describing their plan to fight back against the hijackers. However, there's a significant piece of evidence that has never been released to the public: the complete cockpit voice recorder, CVR, audio. Flight 93's CVR was recovered from the crash site in relatively good condition, capturing the final 30 minutes aboard the aircraft, including the passenger revolt and the plane's final moments. While the 9/11 Commission created a transcript of the recording, only family members of the victims have been allowed to hear the actual audio, and even then, under strict security with no recording devices permitted. What makes this particularly interesting is that several family members who listened to the recording have made statements suggesting the public transcript differs significantly from what they heard. In particular, at least 3 family members have independently mentioned hearing sounds of continued struggle in the cockpit during the final moments before impact, sounds not reflected in the official transcript, which indicates the hijackers had already made the decision to crash the plane before the passengers breached the cockpit. In 2004, a brief excerpt of the hijackers' voices from the recording was played during the 9/11 Commission hearings, but the portions involving the passenger uprising remain restricted from public access, ostensibly to protect the privacy of the victims and their families. In 2008, a former FBI analyst who had worked with the recording during the investigation made an unusual statement in a retirement interview, noting that the public version of events is simplified and that what those people did was even more heroic than what's been portrayed. When asked to elaborate, he declined further comment. The government maintains that the complete recording is too traumatic for public release and contains nothing that would substantively change the understood narrative of Flight 93. However, the discrepancies noted by family members and the unusual security surrounding this particular piece of evidence have fueled speculation that the final minutes aboard Flight 93 may have been more complex than the official account suggests. If the complete, unedited CVR recording were ever released, it might provide a more nuanced understanding of one of the most significant acts of civilian resistance in modern American history. Or it might reveal nothing beyond what we already know. Either way, its continued classification ensures it remains one of the most intriguing pieces of lost media from a pivotal historical event. The question that matters. Throughout this journey into disturbing lost media, we've examined recordings that vanished for various reasons: to hide crimes, to protect reputations, to conceal incompetence, or simply due to the passage of time and circumstance. Some of these lost recordings might still exist in secure government archives or private collections. Others are truly gone forever, destroyed to ensure their contents never reach the public eye. But here's the question worth asking. Should all lost media be found? Would seeing the final moments of disaster victims serve any purpose beyond morbid curiosity? Would hearing the dying words of those who never intended their private suffering to become public entertainment advance our understanding of humanity? Would exposing traumatic events that families have fought to keep private honor the memories of those involved? The answer isn't simple. While historical truth deserves preservation, human dignity sometimes demands discretion. The line between important documentation and exploitation isn't always clear. Yet some lost media genuinely deserves recovery. Recordings that might expose criminality, correct historical misconceptions, or provide closure to those affected by tragedy. The challenge lies in distinguishing between what we want to see out of curiosity and what actually needs to be seen for justice or understanding. So, as you go about your life, knowing what potentially exists in these shadows of history, consider this. Which of these recordings would you really want to experience if given the chance? And more importantly, why? The most disturbing aspect of lost media isn't what was captured on those recordings. It's what their disappearance reveals about ourselves and the society we've built. One that sometimes prefers comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. If you found this dive into the darkness interesting, hit subscribe to explore more hidden corners of our strange reality. Until next time, remember that sometimes what's missing tells us more than what remains.